Good afternoon, City of Rochester. We're really thankful that you have joined us for another episode of the Equity Alliance Equity Series. Of course, the date today is June 12th of 2024. We're experiencing some interesting weather, so glad to be inside for this. And today we're really excited to have a conversation about investing in community and thinking about that from a very equitable lens, looking at some case studies that have been or will be shared. As a reminder, the Equity Alliance is an organization that has an aspiration to co-creating a community that we want to live in and ensuring that all people are engaged in those processes and in the outcomes that we all hope for. There are 5 main anchors that the Equity Alliance kind of adheres by or is committed to. One is continuous improvement, diversity, equity, inclusion, action planning, economic impact, transparency, and radical collaboration. And looking at all of the folks who've joined us today, it's quick and easy to see the collaboration that exists in this community. And we're happy to have you here. Today's episode, I think, is particularly important because we're able to recognize the growth that we're having, kind of unprecedented for the next 10 years. We know that our community has changed even in the last 20 years. And so it is a good time to have a conversation about things that we need to think about, commitments that we need to make, or lenses that we need to have as that community grows. And we're really excited to have 2 folks join us today. I have their bio up on the screen and I will not read everything, but Zakcq Lockrem is an urban planner and designer who loves working in the big picture, understanding how complex systems influence people's lives and how policy programs and physical projects can work together to sustain lasting impact in community. I love that he says that he most enjoys working with low and middle income working class communities like the one he grew up in as they navigate urban change, seek to build greater access to resources and opportunities for themselves and their children. And then Carrie, who I've also had the pleasure of working with, is a registered landscape architect who works on a broad range of parks, ecology, and equity-related planning and design projects that enhance urban ecosystems, public health, and environmental justice. She's especially interested in how participatory design processes build ecological and social resilience in communities. And that's the conversation that we are hoping to have today. So please feel free to ask questions. I'm joined by Wafa El Khalifa, my partner from DMC, who will be monitoring that chat and ensuring that all of your questions get responses. So with that, if you would like to welcome Zakcq and Carrie as they share learning with us today.
Well, hello, everyone. I think we're going to start sharing our screen and we'll do a couple little introductions here. But we're very, very excited to have had the opportunity to come and talk with you all today. And I'm looking especially forward to the question and answer period at the end where we can talk a little bit more together. But we wanted to start by giving a little bit of an overview of our firm and the work we do. And we're going to touch on, I think, 4 different projects that we've been working on that all represent different ways of thinking about equity as a way of doing planning and design and thinking about outcomes for communities that have historically been underrepresented in the planning process. And I say underrepresented. Sometimes when I say that word, I sort of feel like it doesn't really convey the ways that some communities have been purposefully excluded from these sorts of processes and from these sorts of opportunities. So I do want to call that out as a, sometimes our language fails us a little bit when we're talking about these sorts of things. And we're going to talk about communities that have been purposefully excluded and how they are working to bring themselves back into processes and think about opportunities for themselves in the future as well. So we're going to start with a little introduction to our firm. Our name is Mend Collaborative, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that name means to us. But we're a planning and design firm. We were founded in 2022 with the goal of pursuing projects that sit in between planning and design, but with a real focus on equity in urban planning and landscape architecture and urban ecology. And we're based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and Austin, Texas, 2 cities with unique histories, unique challenges relating to everything from racial equity to growth that we'll be able to talk a little bit more about. There are 4 partners at Men Collaborative, so 2 of us are going to be presenting today. My name again is Zakcq Lockrem. I'm an urban planner by training, and I focus a lot on things like planning and policy, storytelling, culture, urban design as key components. And I'm going to allow Carrie to introduce herself as well here.
Hey everyone, my name's Carrie Spiegelhalter. I'm also a co-founder and partner at Mend Collaborative, and I'm a licensed landscape architect. So I really kind of think about how the design of places, especially in growing communities and in places and communities where voices have historically been left out, how we can grab those voices, how we can integrate them into the design processes of our public spaces and really make sure those spaces represent the needs of community members who have been historically left out of the design process. So where Zakcq is thinking a little bit more big picture, I'm a little bit more on the ground on how these places will actually look and what is included in them.
And we have 2 other partners, Sandy Mullners, who is here in Minneapolis with me and is also a landscape architect, and Michelle Bright, who is in Austin, Texas, and is really thinks about ecology as a kind of key way of thinking. And we came together to start Men Collaborative. Really, all of us in our careers had experienced ways in which people who are not from dominant cultures have challenges in being able to move forward within the professional setting of design, and that we're often asked to sort of suppress parts of ourselves when we're thinking about how we as practitioners actually do the work that we're doing. And so our idea was really about starting a place where women, people from the LGBTQ community, people of color, immigrants, people from working class backgrounds could all have a firm that was really centered around the belief that the perspectives that each of us bring from our lived experience is actually an important part of what strengthens our ability to design, and that design and planning will be better when we have more perspectives that are brought together and are brought forward in the work that we're doing. So within that, we also really want to stay committed to fostering an internal practice where we're bringing people for mentoring, where we're really working to include a lot of different types of people, different perspectives, different disciplinary backgrounds in the work that we're doing, as well as when we're looking at external partners and the types of people that we will work with. We really work to try and prioritize women and minority-owned businesses and really bringing a lot of diverse perspectives. We're the 4 partners, but on the next slide, we always want to call out that we work as a team. So we're showing you a lot of beautiful work. We don't want to take credit for all of it. This is the team that we work with on this work. Right now, we have 5 employees who are working with us on, again, a variety of different topics coming from a variety of different backgrounds and perspectives. So we want to always make sure that we're acknowledging the work that Kennedy, Olivia, Todd, Bindu, and Everett bring to the work, and really celebrating the ways in which their perspectives also inform the work that we do.
So kind of getting back to our name as Mend Collaborative, what does that mean? And what does it mean to mend as an action that we participate in as our planning and design processes? And we really think and see mending happening in many different ways. So here's an example of a picture of a darning sample that's kind of showing all different ways that one can use various stitching to mend garments. And so we have multiple meanings and multiple ways that we mend places and communities back to places as part of our planning and design processes. So that's really thinking about restoring and repairing connections to land and community and places and to each other, working with elements that are already present, and seeing what you can do with that versus adding new things, reestablishing relationships like between communities and cities and landscapes and land. And then mending is really iterative and ongoing, never fully finished. And then why do we mend? We really see this as important because our cities and communities and ecologies have experienced harm through planning and design practices that have historically left out people in these conversations and has caused harm to the land that we work with. And so our projects are really contextual, and there's not a one-size-fit-all approach. Mending doesn't hide the past, and it's inclusive of human, non-human, and environmental factors. So we have three ways of mending. We see it happening through restoration, through repair, and through deep collaboration. And we'll talk about how those words kind of guide our practices as we do our planning and design projects.
Great.
So Zakcq, you want to, yeah.
Yep, I'm going to start out talking a little bit about how we think about restoring, which is, as we define it, the act of returning something to a former owner, place, or condition. And the project lens that I want to talk about with, which I'm sure many of you will be aware of to some extent, is the work that we've done with Reconnect Rondo in St. Paul, Minnesota. We were selected to lead a process for Reconnect Rondo called the Anti-Displacement and Community Investment Strategy for the work that they're doing. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. But I always like to start with the context of the place. And context for us is so important because it really informs the way that we're thinking about how we got to where we actually are. On the left, some of you may be aware of an Instagram channel called Segregation by Design. If you have not followed them, I really do recommend it. They do this really incredible mapping of cities around the country and really looking at the way that communities of color throughout the country have been targeted by highway construction. The image that you see is actually a map from the mid-1950s that showed where African Americans lived in the Twin Cities at that time. You can see associated with that numbers of population. So you can see G, which is the Rondo community in St. Paul, was the largest African American community in the Twin Cities at the time, with a little over 7,000 people living there. Superimposed on that map, you can see these red lines. That's the Twin Cities highway system as it has been built out today. It probably doesn't surprise you that you can see that there is a one-to-one overlap between where people of color lived in the Twin Cities, even when the numbers were under 20,000 people in the entire Twin Cities, that these communities were specifically targeted for removal as a part of the highway construction. But let's pause there for a minute. We'll keep that in our minds, but let's think about what Rondo was at that time. The Rondo community was a thriving African-American community of businesses, homes, middle-class people, working-class people. Part of the reason that Rondo is located where it was is that many of the folks in the community actually worked for the railroads. There were a lot of Pullman porters and other folks who were walking or taking the streetcar to Union Station in downtown St. Paul. And that this sort of space, which was just beyond the cathedral and beyond all of the mansions and the beautiful spaces that we see on Summit Avenue in St. Paul, was the space that had essentially been set aside for a more African-American community to live. So this was a community that was really based on the industries that were there in St. Paul and the types of jobs that were available to people. And it was a thriving working class community. When I think about my family, which goes 4 generations deep in South Minneapolis, and I read the oral histories of Rondo, I see my grandparents in that, even though I'm a white working class person. It's the same types of jobs. It's the same types of communities that my family grew up in as well. Rondo Avenue itself, when the highway was eventually put through there, lost hundreds of jobs and hundreds of homes were taken out within that space. And one of the things that Reconnect Rondo has done has really been working to quantify and think about what that actual impact has been on that community during that time. And so they've done some really incredible studies, really looking at what was the impact, the cumulative impact of the generational loss that was wealth, or the generational wealth that was lost through the loss of that property. In the work that they've done, they've actually been able to say things, you know, the housing and businesses that were lost in the 1960s, by the 1980s, that would have been enough wealth to send over 2,000 people to college. And you can only imagine now that we're in 2022, how much more that wealth has actually grown. Now, for me, it was actually only after I started working on this project that I learned that my family actually had a history of highway removal as well. You know, these highways targeted African-American communities, but there were other places where they went through working class communities as well. And I had never known that as a part of my family story. It was something that I learned through this process. One of my aunts told me when she learned of the work that I was doing. And what was remarkable to me, you know, obviously it personalizes things and it helps you think a little bit more about like what have these impacts been over generations. I have two aunts. One of them had graduated from high school before the family lost its house to the construction of Highway 62, and one who had not. The one who had finished high school, she went on to a college. She married someone that she met in college, went on to white collar jobs, and her children today mostly work in those white collar sort of professions. My aunt, who had not finished high school when the family lost their home, she actually dropped out. She got married at 16. And her side of the family has mostly stayed in more blue collar jobs and has struggled quite a bit as we've moved through the generations to see people actually gaining wealth and gaining education. So when we talk about these homes that were removed, we're talking about actual families that have had actual impacts that have rippled through generations. And I think that's really one of the most important things for us to be thinking about. Reconnect Rondo has a vision of not just establishing a deck over the highway, actually returning some of the land that has been taken from the community in the past, but really wants to think about how they are using that to leverage and focus the idea of an African-American cultural enterprise district that stretches throughout the historical boundaries of Rondo. And that idea is one where we are concentrating on making sure that we are thinking about the ways that the African-American community that has been most impacted by that removal are the ones who also have the potential to benefit from the projects, the infrastructure that is done in that place. So as I told you, the study that we worked on was called the Anti-Displacement and Community Investment Strategy. So I want to talk real quick about both of those two things. So anti-displacement, what do we mean by that? I've already talked some about what displacement means. It can mean that the government comes, takes your home, maybe gives you some remediation for that. If you're a renter, you're not qualified for that. Yeah, you know, if you're a homeowner, do you actually get the full market value or not? These are all questions that can come forward. But in the 60s and 70s, a lot of the time when we talked about displacement, that's what we were talking about, people actually losing their homes. We don't do that so much anymore. When we're building highways, when we're doing things, people take great strides to avoid displacing people in that way. But there are other types of displacement that still happen. One type of displacement that can happen is when investments cause costs to rise within a community and people can no longer afford to be there. They can no longer really be in place in that way. The second type of displacement that can happen is when people just no longer feel comfortable. You know, it's the process that we call gentrification, that the businesses don't serve them anymore, the community doesn't serve them anymore, and they don't feel a sense of belonging anymore. And they decide that they actually they want to move out. So the idea of the African-American Cultural Enterprise District is really about creating what Reconnect Rondo calls a sort of force field of protection around the neighborhood, where we are putting in place policies to ensure that people are not priced out, that people who want to remain in the neighborhood can, and that we are thinking about making sure that the businesses, the culture, the cultural expression in the arts, all of those reflect the African-American community in a way that makes sure that people really feel a sense of belonging in those spaces. Those are two of the most important things that we were thinking about. Now, the land bridge is a long-term project, right? This, probably the best case scenario, construction wouldn't start until probably around 2035 on something like this. what we are doing in terms of the anti-displacement strategy work that is happening has to happen well in advance of any actual investment or construction. You know, here in the Twin Cities with the light rail construction, one of the things that we're finding is that developers are getting more and more sophisticated about thinking about the potential for redevelopment well in advance of projects actually being done. And so those rising costs and some of those other things that can actually endanger communities are happening earlier and earlier before we are actually getting to the point of actually having construction happen. And in fact, when we started to look at the data, we found that actually displacement had been happening in Rondo already over the last 20 years. We were already seeing that there was a decline in African-American home ownership in the area, that there was an overall decline in African-Americans being represented in the area as well. So with the anti-displacement strategy, part of what we're trying to do is actually create tools and policy that will create a new type of economic cycle. So specifically, we're working on developing two types of tools, a fund and a trust. And I'll talk a little bit about the difference between those things, that would allow value that's being created within the community to be reinvested in the community, both through things like housing, parks and open space, entrepreneurial space, new benefits, but also creating opportunities for direct benefits to go to community members. So actually having community members have a share in the real estate that is being developed in their company, so they're actually getting financial benefit from things that are happening in their community. And then that creates a cycle that allows the wealth that's built within that community to continue to create that cycle. All of this is being done through community engagement and really working with the community members to ensure that community members feel that they have the information that they need in order to be able to make good decisions. So some of the things that we've heard from the community include, first of all, a recognition that displacement has happened and is happening, and that we need to make sure that we are investing now to ensure that people are able to remain in place, and creating mechanisms for people who want to return to the neighborhood who have been displaced to actually be able to do so. So one of the things that you may have heard of is something called the Inheritance Fund in St. Paul. And that is money that has been made available for descendants of Rondo, so people who were directly displaced or their descendants, to be able to receive down payment assistance to be able to move back into the city of St. Paul. And you actually get more down payment assistance if you move within Rondo as well. So beginning to create actually a right of return for people who have been historically displaced from the community to be able to come back. Another thing that we heard is that there's a strong need to make sure that we're stabilizing housing now, both for owners and for renters. There's a large population of elders in the community who have a significant amount of delayed maintenance on their home that they need assistance with, that there's needs for people to be able to help people clear their title and be able to set up things to be able to actually hand them down to their families. And then there's needs on the renter side as well that aren't being met currently with the housing that's there. So really making sure that we're working to make an investment in making sure that housing is stabilized, available, affordable to people within the community as it exists. And then the final thing that we really talked a lot about with the community is that they really wanted to have a deep understanding of how we were creating financial tools that were actually going to be able to have them see benefits from what is being done in the community. And the biggest part of that we've really been working on developing is an idea called a community investment trust. The idea with the community investment trust is it's something that you could receive shares in. And what we're working on is a system where you could buy shares if you want to join this investment pool. But we're also looking at ways that we can receive philanthropic money to be able to actually just give shares to people who should have had wealth that they don't have today. And really trying to make it a restorative practice so that people can be able to really receive some benefit that they should have historically been receiving. So what that might look like in the future is someone who is moving into affordable housing, potentially through something like the land trust. They are receiving subsidized housing. They're stabilizing their housing situation, creating an opportunity for them to really build educational opportunity, build job opportunity, and so on. But at the same time, they're actually also receiving shares so that when that apartment building gets built in the neighborhood next door to them, some of that money is actually coming back into their pockets from that developer. They are actually working as the developer in that situation. So on the next slide, you can really imagine how that begins to change the conversation. So part of what we also worked to analyze was what could be built on this land bridge that's being proposed, and how would we structure the management of that in order to make sure that people are actually seeing a return. So all of you have probably been a part of a neighborhood planning process, and I'm sure you've seen sometimes frustration from community members. You know, why do we want a big new apartment building in our neighborhood? I would like things to maybe remain smaller scale or more similar. And a part of that is because people don't really see what the benefit to them is going to be in that situation. But you can imagine that that conversation is significantly different if now what we are building is actually returning money into the community and that they're actually being investors in that. So we can begin to talk about how many homes are we providing? How can we make sure that those homes are affordable to people that will add to the community, to people like teachers, to people like first responders, to artists and culture bearers within the community? How many small businesses would we be able to support through different levels of development? How much community use would we be able to do? How does that actually match together with parks and open space? So it begins to create a much different conversation with the community about what type of community that they envision. Ultimately, one of the biggest things that we were saying to the community is that if we want to prevent the displacement of African Americans and Black people from Rondo, we need to actively be working to bring more African Americans and Black people into the community. We need to bring more Black-owned businesses. We need to bring more folks that are going to continue to invest and work in creating community wealth for the community. One last thing before we move on from this project. One of the things that I've been reflecting on quite a bit through this work and other work we've been doing is when we do these large infrastructure projects, a lot of the time what we're doing is we're taking federal transportation money. That money is very siloed. It can only be used for one thing. When the need that we have in the community is, it's in housing, it's in job development, it's in all of these other buckets. And I've been trying to kind of work out in my mind, how do we think about the level of investment that is required in these other places to go alongside the investment that's being made in transportation? The latest cost estimates that I've seen for the Rondo Land Bridge and the reconstruction of I-94 are in the range of 300 to 400 million. What we identified in this project is that there is around $90 million worth of need for investment in housing and other things that needs to happen in the decade before that transportation investment is made. So you can see that there's almost, in this case at least, a 1-to-4 ratio of the need as it relates to anti-displacement as it relates to the actual infrastructure investment that would happen as well. So I'm going to hand it over to Carrie to talk about a next project.
Thanks, Zach. We're going to talk about a project that's a little bit closer to home. This is the Silver Lake Park Master Plan that was completed by Zach and myself and other team members in 2022 when we were with a different consulting firm. And I'm going to talk about this kind of in the context of as communities change and grow, how you make sure the public spaces and amenities and types of communities that are being designed can really reflect the needs and desires of that changing community and how you can bring in those voices. So when we were working on this master plan process a couple of years ago, actually working pretty closely with Chow, which was wonderful, we really wanted to make sure we were integrating voices of the Rochester East African community. And just thinking a little bit about that process and reflecting on it, as you're working in kind of ways where you're integrating communities into design processes, you have to be really flexible in how that goes. And so our initial thought to do research was to put out a survey that was translated in Somali, and we did not get, I think, any survey participants from the Somali community or people responding to the survey in that language. And so we realized we really had to change tactics in order to make sure that we're really engaging with that group of people. And so we ended up doing a focus group and working with our kind of collaborators that are based out of Rochester, the Intercultural Mutual Assistance Association, to help do translations of focus groups where we provided gift cards to members of the population that were from the East African community, speaking directly to them about what they would like to see as part of this park process, to really make sure the park reflects their needs, their desires, because as Zakcq mentioned, sometimes it's not only that people are priced out of communities and homes and neighborhoods because of cost issues and affordability issues, but because of they feel kind of culturally isolated or culturally displaced. And so we really wanted to make sure that the design of this park master plan reflected the needs of that community. And so what ended up being integrated as part of that is the desire to have a kind of meditation or praying space where community members that are Muslim could practice salat and do their prayers. And this area would be fenced to disallow dogs from entering. And then also in this kind of south area south of 7th Street here, I know it's a little hard to see, there's a shelter that could be updated to include a wudu station so that members of the Muslim community could wash prior to praying. So if we had simply just gone with the survey, or if we had done these more traditional methods of community engagement and weren't able to pivot and kind of make adjustments in the way that we're doing that engagement, we wouldn't have heard that and it wouldn't have been included. And so really thinking about how engaging with community members can help change the outcome of the design and making sure you're having those conversations and not checking boxes when you're doing community engagement. This is just a rendering, not of that area that I described, but from the master plan that shows the splash pad, which I believe now has been changed to become just an update to the pool. And then we also had a skate park integrated into the park design as well.
Great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about downtown Denton. I don't know if any of you have ever been to Denton, Texas. It might feel very far away from Rochester, but part of the reason I wanted to spotlight it is because I know that you guys are experiencing a significant amount of growth and thinking about how growth and history really fit together. So Denton is a place, it's a university town just north of Dallas. It's a really, really wonderful community, really exciting, youthful community with a lot going on. And it's a community that's growing very quickly. In 1920, the community was only about 20,000 people. In the year 2000, it was about 70,000 people. Today, it has just topped 150,000. So you can really see the speed of the growth that they've been going through and thinking about it. So we've been engaged to work with them on a new plan for their downtown. And a big part of this plan, and again, something that I know Rochester has been going through, has been really thinking about how do we maintain historical assets while really facilitating the level of development that as a city of 150,000, the area needs. So we always do a really in-depth engagement process as a part of that. And I can say we're nearing the end of this project. Through all of the different methods that we used, we were able to engage with over 3,000 members of the community, online, in person. And a lot of what we do is actually going to different community events and things like that. So people who don't naturally kind of drift to these types of public engagement events, really trying to connect with them where they are and really get perspectives from people that don't usually attend. If we go to the next slide, you can see just some of the different ways that we've reached out to people, going to community festivals, using workshops, using online tools. We've really been doing a lot more of that since the pandemic, where we've really learned that you can really connect with a lot of different communities in different ways, actually being able to do some of that online as well. So as a part of this plan, one of the things that came up early on was really an excitement around reinvesting in a park space that was downtown. So Quakertown Park is just north of downtown, and it for a long time has been an area that's been kind of a civic center for the community. However, a lot of Denton residents today didn't really understand the path of the community. The map that you see here is the outline of the park in blue, but what you see underneath it is an old road network and homes and businesses that were actually in the footprint of the park. This park was historically Freedmen's Town. So it is an area that after the Emancipation Proclamation, after Juneteenth, which is coming up in just about a week, freed enslaved people began to move into communities around some of these established towns where there were job opportunities and established themselves as a community. And it's called Quakertown. Ultimately, it was because the Quakers, the religious organization, provided a lot of support to this community as they were becoming established in the late 1800s. Now, in the early 19th century, there was a Texas Women's College was founded, and it's just north of this site. And in the early 1900s, there were two things going on. One was that there was this movement called the City Beautiful movement based on work that was being done in Chicago and elsewhere that really said, hey, civic parks, they can be a really important part of the community. We can really install a lot of community pride, and that's really something that can be beautiful for the community. On the other side of things, there was a very active KKK organization in this area that was very uncomfortable that the African-American community in Denton was so close to the white women's university. So through a campaign of combination of citywide voting, but also intimidation by these local KKK members, ultimately, the African-American community was removed from the site and it turned into a park. And so as this history was becoming more understood through and really after the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, more people in Denton were becoming aware of it. There was a big question about how do we acknowledge those histories and think about what has happened in Denton in the past, while also understanding that this park is really an important part of our downtown community. And so some of the work that we began to do was really research, as I said, into some of what had been there in the past, as well as beginning to engage really deeply with descendants of Quakertown. There are folks that are only one generation removed from this removal that are still alive. And there were people that were removed that even 10 or 15 years ago were actually telling their stories. And luckily, we were able to videotape and do oral histories before some of those people passed in order to do that. So we're really working through a process of thinking about the context of this place, what impact it has had historically on the African-American community, how it had helped create a situation where the African-American community, alongside all of the Jim Crow laws that were in place in the South, didn't really feel like downtown was a place for them, that had felt and actually were excluded from those spaces. And how can we actually begin to create new opportunities for folks that have been in Denton for generations, but have been excluded from some of the wealth and growth that has happened there. So we did some in-depth work with those communities. Oh, and I'm sorry, I forgot this slide was in here. One of the other layers of history is that one of Texas's most prominent architects in the 1960s and 70s, a man whose last name was Ford, had actually designed a number of the buildings, including a library, a civic center, and city hall that were actually present in the space. So we had this other history that was also very important, and that all of these buildings had actually been historically protected. So we have this older history that is suppressed. We have this newer history that has celebrated. And how do we get them to think about coexisting within the space and really being able to think about that? So working with descendants, one of the first things that we learned was, first, they didn't want to call anything in here a memorial. No one had died, and they said that that was important to them, that what we're talking about are monuments and not memorials. We want to be acknowledging the past, but with an eye to how we're thinking about the future. The second thing that they said is that they didn't just want one monument, they wanted it to be a continuous story throughout. So in the ultimate design that we've been working on, we've actually created a number of different spaces, and we've created a process where the descendants will be able to work with an African-American artist or architect to actually design out these spaces, but that they will include large visible monuments in prominent spaces throughout the park that really talks about the importance of the type of monument that's going on in the space. But then they also want to acknowledge some of the specific locations. For example, where the school was in the community was really important to people, and actually having something that was on that specific space was really, really important to people. There were also things that people brought from memories of the space that they wanted to bring forward. There was a specific woman who really loved white lilacs, and she grew them kind of all throughout the community. And one of the biggest memories that people had for folks that had been there that had passed this along to their children was the smell of the lilacs in the spring. And so being able to take some of those sorts of things and actually incorporate them into the landscape design of the process, so that there's these moments that we're acknowledging and bringing back pieces of the place, while also thinking about the way that the park needs to support these other historic buildings, historic uses, and can move them forward. And for me, one of the most important things that we heard that was actually brought forward by one of our members of our team, Todd Austin, the monuments are important and we need to look forward, but what is Quakertown Park doing today for the African-American community? And that really became a focus as well, and really working with the community members. So talking about the ways that we are starting to put forward way that African-American artists have opportunities to create art within the park. We started talking about actually adding some vendor spaces and things like that to the park, and thinking about how we could prioritize African-American entrepreneurs from the community as the vendors within that space. So there's an economic connection, making sure that the culture and arts and festivals and things like that are reflecting the needs and desires of the African-American community, and making sure that the space is really creating opportunities for the existing community that now lives primarily in a community called Southeast that's just outside of the park, to actually be able to interact with those spaces as well. So, you know, I think this is a really successful example of the way that having the right voices as a part of the engagement, prioritizing the right voices, is really creating meaningful outcomes that reflect the past while also thinking about the future needs of the community as well. Oh, and one last slide here. These are some examples that have been brought to the community and that really reflected well with them. Thinking about things that are abstract but very visible, that begin to be able to tell the story. People were very attracted to the idea that there might be some spaces where maybe we're recreating the front stoops of some of the buildings, so that people actually have a space that they could move through and sit down and have conversations and see some of those impacts, or even trails that begin to recreate some of that original street network, so that the story can be told in the places that people were actually in.
The last project we're going to talk about is All Abilities Playground Planning Process in El Paso, Texas. And this was a project that we were brought in on to kind of help the city decide where they wanted to put a new playground for kids with varying abilities, whether it's intellectual disabilities, visual impairments, hearing impairments, other physical impairments. And because as the city was growing, they were realizing that they didn't have an opportunity for children with different abilities to be able to play. So that's kind of another thing to think about. As cities grow, you need to make sure you're providing services for specific types of, you know, groups that need different ways of doing things and participating in community. So a big part of this project was kind of community engagement, thinking about where first of all, where this park would be, and then also what exactly would go into the park itself. And we really wanted to interact directly with children to think about what would go into the park. And so we had a series of play sessions where we observed kids kind of using different elements of play, like sensory objects, dinosaur themes, other types of themes, using stickers to say what are kids really attracted to, and then building blocks so that we could watch children build their own playgrounds to see what are they interested in, what really excites them that could be represented in this playground. And then we also surveyed caretakers for children with different abilities and kind of asked about what they would want to see in the play area. And so we heard things like play towers, different height basketball hoops, wheelchair swings, open play lawn, table games were also really popular. And we also asked what amenities would make caregiving easier for you, and making sure that we're providing spaces for the family members that are taking care of kids with different abilities. So having benches, ADA parking, picnic areas, places to sit, pavilions, drinking fountains, etc. And then this data was actually combined with a geospatial analysis of where exactly this playground should be placed. And so we did kind of a land parcel prioritization where we were looking at where should we place this all abilities playground. It should be about, at least a mile away from any existing playground. It should be located in census tracts with a higher percentage of disabled persons. It needs to be adjacent to parking. It should be located in census tracts with higher social vulnerability, centrally located in El Paso. And we kind of worked with community members and City of El Paso to help prioritize those things. And we did an analysis of all of the kind of available parcels in the city for something like this. And the city was able to make a selection of a parcel based on that process. And so what really stands out as part of this All Abilities Playground process was thinking about how we combine the kind of quantitative outputs of this mapping process of selecting a site for the playground, and how we're emphasizing equity, how we're emphasizing looking at locating this playground in census tracts with higher social vulnerability, and then how the qualitative conversations that we're having with caretakers, the outcomes of those play shops, are helping to inform what actually goes into that park once it's being located. And so these were some of the recommendations that we had for the park itself once it gets into a building stage. So from our community engagement, we learned about what types of physical activities children wanted to do and caretakers wanted to see at the park, having calm spaces and solo spaces for kids with sensory issues, etc. And so kind of all of that came together as a part of our recommendation for where the park should be located and what exactly should go into the park itself.
So I think we're going to stop there and we'll be able to take some questions. If you do follow the QR code here too, you'll find our website as well as some other materials about us. If I can just leave you with one thing to think about, when we're thinking about equity as a key component of planning and design and the types of outcomes, I think one of the things that we really want to encourage people to think about is who is being able to come to the table. There's an old community organizer saying, nothing for us without us. And I think it's really important for us to be thinking about that as we're thinking about how we are working to bring different people to the table, as well as how our project teams ultimately can reflect the communities that they're working in, to ensure that the types of perspectives and the types of lived experience that we are having inform our outcomes are reflective of the places that we're ultimately working with. So I'll close out with that, and we'd be excited to take some questions or have a conversation.
If folks would like to unmute and ask a question, please proceed and do that. I see Al is ready.
Okay. You mentioned the fact that for the Silver Lake master plan that you were involved with that planning. Was that with a different organization before this? Is that my hearing? But
That's right. We were both with a different consulting firm called Asakura Robinson at the
okay,
time. And
yeah,
I was the project manager for the project, and Zakcq was kind of leading it.
yeah. So follow up on that was that because I was able to find the master plan that was produced on the city website. So as far as that was concerned, my question really is that maybe twofold. Maybe one is that as far as I know, Rochester doesn't have necessarily similar experience as like Rondo in St. Paul area. So how do you take that? Because the way you approach the philosophy is that there's a restoration aspect. So the city of Rochester,
Mm.
how do you even do you consider that restoration? Because there was no historical, as I could tell, in a large scale like Rondo. And how do you approach that that aspect of the need to it?
Yeah. Thanks for that question, Al. I was curious if it's okay. I'll venture a little bit of an answer and then we can jump in. So we like to use a framework, and this gets technical here quick, and I you'll have to excuse me. My degree is actually in history and philosophy of planning, so I can kind of get out there sometimes, but we really like to try and think about what intersectional planning and design looks like. So when we talk about these spaces, there have always been groups that have been included or excluded from benefits, whether we're talking about from the perspective of race or class or gender or other sorts of areas. So whenever we talk about any kind of historical space, we really do try to start by really looking at who was this space built for and how has it impacted different folks. Here in Minneapolis, we have one of the greatest park systems in the country. It is really a wonderful place. When you look at some of the early designs and some of the earlier folks who were really trying to put their footprint on it, part of what the park system was designed for was an idea that they were civilizing all of the new immigrants that were coming to the United States. They were trying the elite of the community, who were mostly folks who had come from New England, were actually using design elements that they felt would encourage all of the Scandinavians and Germans to shape up and start acting like real Americans as a part of that design. And so, even in a case where everyone is white at the time, people are still finding ways to make differences between them and actually create spaces of exclusion and inclusion. And so part of what we're looking at is how has that actually transmitted over time, and how does that impact the spaces today when we're thinking about what the opportunities are. We want to recognize that sometimes we're talking about historic communities that have been there. Sometimes we're talking about places that are changing, and there's new communities that are coming in that also need to be brought in the process, and think about how they have different needs or changing needs. So I think in Silver Lake, the process was a little bit less about the history component, although we did examine that and kind of look at the way that that space was originally imagined as kind of a space for some of the upper class neighborhoods that existed at the time in the adjacent spaces. The ways that that had maybe become more democratic through places like the pool and some of those other spaces. And then the new communities that were beginning to really move in on East and West. And that included things like looking at the history, but also digging deep into health incomes and how health was impacted in different areas of the park, how that could actually help impact and create opportunities for people relating to health and access to some of these spaces as well. So it's always a little different with every project, and really trying to find the nugget of what's important for each one as we're thinking about the ways that all those different pieces sort of intermix.
And I sort of neglected to mention this, and I'm sorry, it slipped my mind at the time when I was speaking about that project, but we did work with the Dakota community to kind of come up with a space at the confluence of the Zumbro River and Silver Lake Creek to set aside a space for them with kind of an open type circular design where they could do ceremonies and kind of re-engage with the land there. And so we would kind of consider that to be a kind of restoration of that community's relationship with the land that is historically theirs.
You know, that's an interesting one too. You could actually, if you did a map of the Twin Cities highways and overlap Dakota sacred spaces and the highways, you would see a similar relationship to what you see between African American communities and where the highway was ultimately located as well. So there are these layers that exist in all of these decisions that we hopefully in this next generation will really have an opportunity to unpack.
And Carrie, thank you for mentioning that. And I just wanted to highlight that that's a question that Kendra had put in the chat as well, specific to Indigenous communities. And what I find particularly meaningful for Silver Lake master planning and this outcome was having the Greater Rochester area Dakota come and walk the land and talk about what space particularly was meaningful to them, and picking that confluence where in their oral history had 200 strong Dakota, right, that lived by the river. But most importantly, I think for us as a city, in our acknowledgement about land, is having this as the first public city-owned place where we will have a site that honors the original, folks of the land. So just wanted to highlight that, but also wanting to be conscious about time, knowing the people who have questions. So if you do have additional questions, please place them in the chat and we will make sure to get them to Zakcq and Carrie.
One quick question for Carrie. Thank you very much. This tremendous presentation. In your Silver Lake, and forgive me for not re-looking at the plan, but it's always an aerial view, so it's hard to tell. Will all residents, regardless of their backgrounds, be able to actually see the lake? Or will the 6-foot tall weeds be removed in your design? Or I'd like to, just curious.
I think you'd probably have to check in with the Parks Department on their direction of where they are going based on that design. I think we painted in pretty broad strokes about the kind of landscaping type.
Did you include 6-foot tall weeds in your design, Carrie, just so I know?
I'd have to double check.
Well, John, if I can, I think one of the things that we work hard on is also thinking about the natural systems and harms in some cases that have been done there. So looking at opportunities for shoreline restoration, not weeds, certainly, but natural shoreline. This is another story from the Minneapolis system, but it's actually carried over to other parts of Minnesota as well.
I'm always saddened by people in wheelchairs or other infirmities that cannot see the lake from any angle.
Sure. And I think
appreciate
what we
that very
tried to
much.
do was balance the ecological components with opportunities for people to actually get down to the water and making sure that there are spaces for both of those to happen where it is appropriate.
Thank you.
Yep. Yeah. So thank you very much to everyone that attended. A couple of reminders. First of all, grateful to Zakcq and Carrie, if you want to clap for them virtually. We really appreciate the time and the varied case studies that you shared with us. And hopefully will provide us a lot of thoughtful time as we continue to develop our own spaces. Thank you for pointing out that we need to engage many, many, many years before development starts. So for all of us in different spaces, how do we incorporate that into our thoughts? Couple of reminders, it is Pride Month. So we always want to share with our community all of the different equity things that are happening in different spaces. So make sure you share the love with community members and folks in your organizations that might celebrate Pride Month. The other thing I want to mention is Juneteenth celebration is on Saturday, the 16th, begins at noon at MLK Park. If you're able to join, please do so, as well as a first Juneteenth Jubilee that will be on the 19th. Look for information for that as well. And for those of you who are registered, I think there's still time to do that and join the Next Level Conference tomorrow, 13th and 14th. Grateful to all of you community members. This will be recorded and you can share with other folks in your organization or community that might find this information helpful. Have a great week and see you next month.